The chandeliers of Raven's Hollow Manor blazed like 1,000 frozen stars, throwing trembling light across the marble floor of the great hall, and the orchestra had just struck the opening notes of the season's first quadrille when Marigold Verityquinel did the unthinkable. She crossed the ballroom alone, not on a chaperone's arm, not in the careful, gliding manner her aunt had drilled into her for 6 anxious weeks. She walked, straight, deliberate, her ivory satin slippers whispering against the polished floor, toward the alcove half shadowed by an arrangement of white camellias, where the Duke of Aschenwilde stood entirely alone. Everyone knew the Duke of Aschenwilde did not dance. He had not danced in 4 years, not since the fire at Belmorec Hall, not since the night his younger brother had been carried from the smoke, with eyes still open and lungs already silent. He attended balls only when his presence was demanded by political necessity, and even then he stood apart, in shadowed alcoves precisely like this one, watching the swirl of silk and feathered fans with the still, exhausted attention of a man counting the minutes until he could leave. Hostesses had stopped asking him to dance years ago. Mothers had stopped pushing their daughters in his direction. He was not a man one approached. He was a fact one acknowledged from a respectful distance, the way one acknowledged a thunderstorm beyond a window. Marigold did not stop walking. The conversation around her began to die in waves, like candles being snuffed in a long corridor. First the matrons nearest the dance floor, then the cluster of debutantes by the punch table, then the gentlemen smoking in the doorway. By the time she reached the alcove, the great hall had grown so quiet that she could hear the faint hiss of the gas lamps and the brittle rustle of her own borrowed gown. The Duke turned his head. He was taller than she had imagined from the gossip, and gossip had given her quite a great deal to imagine. Hair the color of wet slate, cut unfashionably short, a face that had once perhaps been considered handsome, before grief had carved beneath the eyes and pressed a thin pale line where his mouth ought to have softened. He wore black on black on black, a single onyx pin at his cravat, and the look he gave her wasn't unkind. It was, however, the look a man gives a creature he cannot identify and is not yet certain whether he ought to be alarmed by. She curtsied. Properly. The way her mother had taught her in the small parlor at Renfold Cottage, before her mother had grown too thin to stand for the lessons. "Your Grace," Marigold said, and was startled to discover that her voice did not shake. "I wonder if you might do me the very great honor of dancing the first set with me." The orchestra played on. The candle wax dripped, 200 pairs of eyes pressed against the back of her neck like a physical weight. The Duke of Aschenwilde looked at her for a long, terrible moment. And then, slowly, with the precision of a man who has not used a particular muscle in a long time, he tilted his head. "Tell me, miss." His voice was low, rough, almost gentle. "What could possibly make a young woman walk across an entire ballroom to ask such a question of me?" Marigold lifted her chin. "I'm afraid, Your Grace," she said, "that I haven't the time to explain it twice. So you'll have to dance with me first." Something flickered behind the Duke's gray eyes. Not amusement, not yet, but the ghost of something that had once been amusement, recognized now from a great distance, like a familiar song heard through a closed door. He did not answer. He simply set down the untouched glass of claret he had been holding, stepped out of the alcove, and offered her his arm. A sound moved through the ballroom, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, more like the collective intake of breath of 100 people who have just witnessed something they will repeat in lowered voices for the rest of the season. Marigold placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve and felt the heat of him through the fine wool, and felt also the iron stillness beneath, the way one might feel the trembling of a horse held too long in check. They walked to the floor together in absolute silence. The conductor, a wiry Italian who had clearly been forewarned about nothing, recovered first and lifted his baton. The orchestra struck up the opening bars of a waltz. Not the quadrille that had been promised, but a waltz, which Marigold suspected was the conductor's own small revolution, his contribution to the scandal already underway. The Duke placed one gloved hand at the small of her back. The other closed around hers. "You dance," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear, for someone with no time to explain things twice. "I dance," she answered, "because my mother once told me that fear is only fear until you give it a different name." His step caught, almost imperceptibly, and then resumed. They turned. The room turned with them. Marigold caught flashes of faces at the edge of the floor, her Aunt Bellatrix gone white as bone, the matriarchal Lady Crestwind, watching with hawk-bright interest, a tall, fair-haired young woman in pale rose silk, whose smile had not moved since the moment Marigold had stepped into the alcove. "They are watching us," the Duke observed. "They are watching you, Your Grace. I am merely the inconvenience attached to your sleeve." His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You speak unusually for a young lady at her first ball." "It is not my first ball." "Forgive me. Your second?" "My third. The first two went rather poorly." "And yet you imagined the third would be improved by approaching me." "I imagined," Marigold said carefully, "that the third could not possibly be made worse." Now he did almost smile, the briefest crease at the corner of his mouth gone before she could be certain it had existed. The waltz spun them past the orchestra. His hand at her back had not relaxed, but it had not tightened either. He was holding her, she realized, with the deliberate carefulness of a man handling something he was not certain he was permitted to touch. "Miss," he said again, "Quinnell. Marigold Quinnell." "Miss Quinnell, I have not danced in 4 years. You will forgive me if I find it difficult to believe that you crossed an entire ballroom on the strength of a poor first season." "I never said it was on that strength." "Then on what strength?" The waltz was approaching its second turn. Marigold drew a slow breath through her nose, the way her mother had taught her to do before saying difficult things, and looked up into the face of the Duke of Ashenwild. "I came to you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "because at 10:30 tonight, a woman in this ballroom is going to publicly ruin my family. And you are the only person in England who can stop her." The music swelled. The Duke's hand tightened, only slightly, at her back. "And what, Miss Quinnell?" he said, in a voice so low she had to lean closer to hear it. "Makes you imagine I would?" Across the ballroom, a clock in the gallery began, very softly, to chime. It was 10:15, 15 minutes. The waltz had 2 more turns left, and then she would have to be ready. "I imagine nothing, Your Grace," Marigold said. "I am told you are an honorable man, and I am gambling on it." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders did. A subtle gathering, the way a great cat shifts its weight before deciding whether to rise. "You are gambling," he repeated. "I had very little else to wager with." "Who is the woman?" "Lady Persimmon Crestwind Pelhaven." The Duke's hand on her back went absolutely still, not tighter, not looser, simply fixed, as though he had ceased for a moment to remember he was dancing. "The Dowager Marchioness," he said. "Yes. That is a substantial enemy for a young woman in her 3rd season." "I did not choose her, Your Grace. She chose me. Or rather, she chose my mother, 22 years ago, and I am only the inheritance of that choice." The waltz turned. The candle wax dripped. A footman moved silently along the gallery, lighting fresh tapers, and Marigold could feel the seconds passing through her like cold water. At 10:30, she continued, low and even. "Lady Crestwind intends to rise during the supper announcement and read aloud a series of letters. They are letters my mother wrote, 22 years ago, before her marriage. They are not scandalous. They are merely private. But Lady Crestwind has been waiting 22 years to make them public. And tonight, with my mother too ill to attend her own daughter's season, she has decided the time has come. Why tonight? Because my father, last week, refused her son in a matter of business, and Lady Crestwind is not a woman who allows debts to go uncollected. And the letters? The letters concern a man Lady Crestwind herself loved, who chose my mother instead. A man who later died of fever in a regiment in the Indies. The letters are nothing. A girl's affection for a young officer who died before he could become anything. But society is not kind to dead loves and living rivals, Your Grace. My mother is fragile. The shame would kill her. The Duke said nothing. They turned together in silence, and the silence was worse than any answer he could have given. You ask me for an extraordinary intervention, he said at last. I ask you for a single sentence, Your Grace, spoken at the right moment, in the right voice, before the right audience. That is all. One sentence from the Duke of Ashenweald would silence Lady Crestwind more thoroughly than 100 sentences from anyone else in this room. And what sentence is that? I cannot tell you yet. The faintest crease appeared between his brows. I beg your pardon? If I tell you now, you will refuse, and the next 9 minutes will be wasted. If I tell you in 7 minutes, when she rises, you will say it, because you will already have begun to believe me. The Duke of Ashenweald stared down at her. For the first time all evening, Marigold saw the precise moment a man stops being polite and starts being interested. Miss Quinnell, he said softly, you are either the boldest creature I have met in a decade, or the most reckless. I am told they amount to the same thing, Your Grace. Not always. Sometimes they amount to ruin. Yes, she said. I am aware. The waltz drew toward its closing bars. Around them, the dancers were beginning to slow, the gentlemen beginning to bow, the ladies beginning to curtsy. In 9 minutes the supper bell would ring, and Lady Crestwind would rise from her seat at the long mahogany table beneath the gallery, and the letters would come out of the small reticule of pearl gray silk that had not left her wrist all evening. What, the Duke said quietly, do you propose to give me in return? Marigold had been waiting for the question. She had rehearsed her answer in the carriage on the way to Ravenshollow, with her hands knotted in her lap and her aunt asleep against the window, and she had told herself that when the moment came, she would not flinch. Whatever you ask, Your Grace, within the bounds of honor. That is a great deal of latitude. It is all I have to offer. The waltz ended. He did not release her hand. The bow he gave her was correct, formal and faultless, and beneath it, his fingers tightened once around hers, and then let go. Walk with me, he said. We have 9 minutes. He led her not back to her aunt, but along the western wall of the ballroom, past the great gilt mirrors and the staring portraits of Ravenshollow ancestors, into a small antechamber where a single tall window looked out upon the moonlit terrace. He shut the door behind them. He did not sit. Tell me, he said. Your Grace. Tell me what you have not told me. Quickly. So she did. She told him about her mother's illness, the small house in Wrenfold, where the windows would not close properly in winter, the £400 her father had borrowed from a man whose name she would not say aloud, the careful campaign of her Aunt Bellatrix to bring her to London for 1 season, in the hope of a respectable marriage that would secure the family. She told him how Lady Crestwind's son had come to her father last week with a proposal of his own, not of marriage, but of patronage, of a particular and degrading kind, and how her father had thrown him out of the parlor with words that no man of Crestwind's pride would ever forgive. The Duke listened without interrupting. His face had not softened, but it had become attentive, and there is a great difference between the two. You wish to be asked to dance tonight, he said when she was finished, by some honorable gentleman who might shield you, and no one asked. No one was going to ask, Your Grace. Lady Crestwind had already seen to that. And so you asked me, and so I asked you. He turned toward the window. The moonlight caught the silver at his temples and the line of his jaw, and for a moment he looked not like a duke at all, but like a man very tired of the weight of his own name. I will help you, he said. Marigold could not at first speak. On one condition, she found her voice. Name it, Your Grace. He turned. His eyes were gray and very clear, and for the first time that evening, she understood why people had stopped, 4 years ago, asking the Duke of Aschenwilde to dance. For 1 full season, you will appear at every event to which I am invited. You will be, to all of London, the woman the Duke of Aschenwilde has chosen to court. You will be seen on my arm, in my carriage, at my table, until the last ball of the year. And on the last night, when the season ends, you will quietly and without scandal release me, and we will never speak of any of this again. Your Grace, I have my own Lady Crestwind, Miss Quinnell. Her name is different, but she is the same kind of woman, and she has been narrowing the field of my eligible brides for 4 years now. Tonight you walked into my alcove and offered me, without knowing it, the only weapon I have not yet tried. A young woman of my own choosing, a young woman she did not select. Marigold stared at him. That is your condition. That is my condition. The clock in the gallery struck the half-hour. From the great hall came the sound of a bell and the murmur of 200 guests turning toward the dais where Lady Crestwind had begun, very slowly, to rise. Your Grace, Marigold whispered, we have no time. Then answer me, Miss Quinnell. She drew 1 breath. 1. Yes. He took her hand. They walked back into the ballroom together, and behind them, in the small antechamber, the candle on the writing desk guttered once, as though something invisible had passed through the room and disturbed it. Marigold did not look back. She did not yet know that on the writing desk behind her, beneath a stack of household ledgers no one had touched in weeks, lay a single sealed letter addressed in her mother's handwriting, a letter that would, in 3 days, change everything she believed about why she had been brought to London at all. Aschenwilde House stood at the western end of Carradine Square, a building of pale Portland stone that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Marigold had passed it once before on a hired hack with her aunt, and she remembered thinking that it looked less like a residence than a sealed monument. Windows shuttered, wrought iron gates always closed, no flowers in the urns. The gate stood open now. The carriage rolled through, and a footman in dove-gray livery handed her down onto the gravel sweep. She had been given less than 10 hours to pack. Her Aunt Bellatrix had wept all the way to the door of the small townhouse on Pellencoat Street, and had embraced her 3 times before letting her into the carriage, whispering, "Be careful, my darling. Be careful." Marigold had not known whether her aunt meant of the Duke, or of the world, or of herself. Inside, the house was warm. That was the first surprise. She had expected a mausoleum. The entrance hall was high-ceilinged, but intimate. The marble floor strewn with rugs the color of old wine. A fire snapping cheerfully in the great stone hearth at the rear. A gray deerhound rose from the rug as she entered, regarded her with patient yellow eyes, and lay down again. The walls were hung not with stiff portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but with paintings of places, moors, sea cliffs, a winter beechwood, as though the master of the house had wished to fill his rooms with anywhere other than himself. Miss Quinnell. The housekeeper was a small, square-shouldered woman in plum bombazine, with iron-gray hair pinned beneath a lace cap, and an expression of brisk, unsentimental kindness. I am Mrs. Tabitha Inchwood. His Grace has asked me to settle you in the south rooms. They were his late mother's. They have not been used in some years." Marigold opened her mouth to protest and closed it again. There was no protest one could usefully make in a house like this. One did as one was told, and one wept later, alone, in the appropriate room. The south rooms occupied an entire wing on the second floor, a sitting room with windows facing the garden, a bedchamber with hangings of pale celadon silk, a dressing room with 3 mirrors, and a wardrobe already half filled with morning gowns in her measurements. Marigold stood in the center of the bedchamber and did not, at first, sit down. If she sat down, she suspected, she would not stand up again for a long while. "His Grace's compliments, miss." A young woman appeared in the doorway, pink-cheeked, with hair the color of dark honey caught beneath a white cap. "I'm Phoebe Renly. I'm to be your maid this season, if you'll have me." "If I'll have you?" Phoebe's mouth twitched. "It's only that the last lady's maid in this household left in 1818, miss. Mrs. Inchwood says I'm not to take it personally, if you'd prefer someone with more experience." Marigold laughed, once, softly, surprised at herself, and Phoebe smiled back, and something in the great cold weight of the morning eased a fraction. "I should be glad to have you, Phoebe." "Very good, miss. There's tea laid in the sitting room, and Mrs. Inchwood says His Grace will not require your company until dinner, which is at 7. Phoebe curtsied and withdrew, and Marigold at last allowed herself to sit on the edge of the great celadon-draped bed. She unwrapped the small parcel she had carried in her own hands from Pellencoat Street, a miniature of her mother in a tortoiseshell frame, and set it carefully on the bedside table. It was then that she noticed the writing desk. It stood beneath the window, walnut and very old, with brass fittings worn pale at the edges, and on its surface, neatly squared, as though placed there that very morning, lay a single folded note in handwriting she did not recognize. "Miss Quinnell," it read, in a small, careful, almost feminine hand. "He's not what you think. Be very careful what you say to him before you have spoken to me." A friend. Marigold sat very still, the note open in her lap, and listened to the great house breathing around her. Dinner was at 7. The note from the writing desk was, by 4:30, folded twice, and pinned inside the lining of Marigold's reticule. She had told no one. She had not yet decided whether she ought to. At 6:45, Phoebe came to dress her, and Marigold submitted to it the way a soldier submits to armor. The gown was deep green silk, modestly cut, with a single row of seed pearls at the neckline. Her hair was drawn back into a smooth coil and pinned with a comb of polished jet. She looked, in the long mirror, older than she felt, and rather more frightened than she looked. "His Grace sent word, miss," Phoebe murmured, fastening the last hook. "His grandaunt has come down from North Witten. She'll be at table tonight." His grandaunt. Lady Honoria Magdalena Ashenwild, miss. The Dowager Countess of Sarnsfield. She arrived an hour ago. A pause. She does not come to London often. And tonight she has come. "Yes, miss." Marigold drew one slow breath. "Phoebe. What should I know about her?" Phoebe hesitated, and Marigold watched her in the glass. The flicker of consideration, the careful weighing of loyalty against kindness, and then the small decision to be brave. "She is the only person in England, miss, that His Grace is afraid of." The drawing room before dinner was lit with 8 tall candles in 2 silver candelabra, and at the far end, in a high-backed chair upholstered in midnight velvet, sat a woman who could have been 70 or 75, or any age at which the body has stopped recording time and the eyes have begun to do it instead. She was very thin. Her hair was the color of old ivory, drawn back so severely that her temples showed the blue tracery of veins. She wore lavender silk in mourning half-cut, 3 loops of pearls at her throat, and a single black lace shawl across her knees. She did not rise. She did not need to. The Duke stood at the hearth, a glass of sherry untouched in his hand. He did not look surprised to see Marigold. He looked, if anything, faintly braced, the way a man stands when expecting a blow he has agreed to receive. "Aunt Honoria," he said, "may I present Miss Marigold Verity Quinnell. Miss Quinnell, my grandaunt, the Dowager Countess of Sarnsfield." Marigold curtsied. She held the curtsy a fraction longer than was strictly necessary, because her mother had once told her that with very old women of very high rank, one curtsied not for them, but for every woman who had ever before failed to. "Come closer, child." Marigold came closer. Lady Honoria's eyes were the color of a winter sky, very pale, very clear, and entirely without the softness that age sometimes lends to such eyes. She studied Marigold for what felt like a long minute, and Marigold, with no instinct left but obedience, allowed herself to be studied. "You are Sophronia Quinnell's daughter." It was not a question. Marigold's breath caught. "Yes, my lady. I knew your mother, briefly, 22 years ago in Bath. She was beautiful then, and very frightened, and she made a marriage that all of Bath agreed was beneath her." "She made a marriage of love, my lady?" "Yes." The pale eyes did not blink. "I was aware. That was what made it so disappointing." The Duke shifted at the hearth. "Aunt, be quiet, Oberon." She did not look at him. "I am speaking with the young woman." "Oberon." Marigold filed the name away. She had not heard him called by his Christian name once. Oberon Lysander Ashenwild. The newspapers had used it after the fire. "Sit down, Miss Quinnell." Marigold sat. The silk of the chair was cold through her gown. "I have come to London," Lady Honoria said, "because at 10:30 last night, my great-nephew Oberon, who has not danced in 4 years, walked across a public ballroom with a young woman no one in this town has heard of, and gave the entirety of polite society to understand that he was courting her. I would like, Miss Quinnell, to know why." Marigold could feel the Duke watching her without turning his head. "Lady Honoria," she said carefully, "I think your great-nephew is best placed to answer that question." "My great-nephew has never in his life answered any question I have put to him. I am asking you." The fire snapped. A coal collapsed inward with a small, bright sound. Marigold felt the folded note inside her reticule like a small, live coal of its own, and decided. "Because I asked him, my lady, and he was kind enough to say yes." The pale eyes narrowed, not in anger. In something more dangerous than anger, in interest. "You asked him?" "Yes, my lady." "For what reason?" "For a reason that is mine, my lady, and that I would prefer, with respect, not to discuss in this room tonight." A long silence, and then, slowly, with the dry creak of old paper, Lady Honoria smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was, however, a real one, which was perhaps rarer. "Oberon, Aunt, pour me a glass of the Madeira, and stop hovering at the hearth like a footman who has lost his post. The girl is not going to bolt." The Duke poured the Madeira. He brought it to her with the careful tenderness of a man who has been doing such small, ordinary kindnesses for a difficult old woman for a very long time. "Miss Quinnell," Lady Honoria said, accepting the glass without looking at it, "I will tell you something that my great-nephew has not told you and cannot bring himself to. 4 years ago, in a fire at our country house at Belmorach, his younger brother Cassian died. Oberon was in the burning room. He was pulled out alive. Cassian was not." Marigold's hand went to the arm of the chair. "My lady, there is more, child. Be still." The old woman's voice was perfectly level. "Oberon believes he chose. He believes that in the dark and the smoke he reached for the wrong shape, and that the shape he reached for was himself. He has not danced since. He has not laughed since. He has not, until last night, voluntarily touched another human being in 4 years. The Duke had set down the sherry. He had turned his face fully into the shadow of the hearth, and Marigold, with a small, wrenching pity, understood that he had not given his grandaunt permission to say any of this. "I tell you this, Miss Quinnell," Lady Honoria continued, "not to wound him, but to warn you. He is a good man. He is also a haunted one. If you are playing some game with him, even an honorable game, I want you to understand precisely what stakes you are gambling with." "I understand, my lady." "Do you? I lost a brother also, 8 years ago, of a fever. He was 9. The Dowager Countess looked at her for a very long moment. "I see," she said quietly. "Then perhaps you do." She lifted the Madeira at last, and drank, and looked toward the fire. "Oberon," she said without turning, "take Miss Quinnell into the gallery before dinner. The light is good there. Show her the small portrait of your grandfather. She will want to have seen it." The Duke set down his glass. He came to Marigold and offered her his arm without a word, and she rose and took it. At the door, Lady Honoria spoke one more time, very softly, almost to herself. "And when you have shown her the portrait, Oberon, show her also the letter that came this morning from North Witten, the one I forwarded, the one in your mother's hand." The Duke went absolutely still. "Aunt, she should know, Oberon. Before the season is 2 days older. She should know." The long gallery of Ashenwilde House ran the entire eastern length of the second floor, and it was, Marigold realized, as the Duke led her into it, a place that had not been intended for anyone but its owner. The candles were lit only at intervals, every fourth sconce, no more, so that the gallery existed in pools of warm gold, separated by long stretches of soft, tolerable dark. The portraits along the wall were not the stern Ashenwilde ancestors she had expected, but a collection of small paintings. A boy of perhaps 10 in a blue coat, holding a wooden horse, a spaniel asleep on a green sofa, a winter beechwood at twilight. The Duke walked her past them all without speaking. He paused only once, at a small painting of a young woman seated at a pianoforte, in 3/4 profile, her hands resting upon the keys. "My mother," he said quietly, "before I was born." Then he walked on. At the far end of the gallery, beneath a single lit sconce, hung a small oil portrait of an elderly man with the same gray eyes as the Duke, and a quite different mouth, wide, faintly amused, the mouth of a man who had laughed often. "My grandfather," the Duke said, "Lord Cuthwin Ashenwilde. He died when I was 14. He was the only person in this family who ever told me a joke." "What was the joke?" He almost smiled. "I do not remember the joke. I remember that he told it." They stood together in the small pool of candlelight, and Marigold, who had been holding herself with great care all evening, allowed her shoulders to lower a 1/4 inch. "Your Grace." "Oberon." He did not look at her when he said it. "When we are not in company. My grandaunt is correct that I have been called Your Grace a great deal. I am beginning to suspect that I have forgotten the sound of my own name. Oberon." He closed his eyes, only for an instant, only long enough that she saw it. Then he opened them again, and turned to face her properly. "My grandaunt told you a great deal she had no right to tell you. She told me what she believed I needed to know. It is not the same thing." "No." He drew a breath, and reached into the inner pocket of his coat, and withdrew a folded letter sealed with green wax that had been broken and pressed back into place. "This came this morning," he said, "from my mother. She lives at North Witten now, with my grandaunt. She has not written to me in 3 years. She believes I am responsible for Cassian's death. Oberon, she is not entirely wrong, Miss Quinnell. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because I do not wish to begin this, whatever this is, between us on any false understanding. He held the letter out. Read it. I cannot. It is private. It is about you. Marigold's fingers closed around the paper before her mind had quite agreed. The letter was short. 3 folded sheets, in a hand that wavered, as though the writer had been forced to set down the pen and pick it up again several times. Marigold read it in the small gold pool of candlelight, with the Duke standing very still beside her. My dear son, Honoria writes to me of a young woman called Quinnell. I write to you because a Quinnell once knew me very well, and because it is possible, Oberon, that this young woman is more bound to our house than she knows. I cannot say more in a letter. I would be glad if you would bring her to North Witten before the season ends. There is something that should have been said to her mother, and was not, and I have carried the cost of that silence for 22 years. I am not yet ready to speak of Cassian, but I would speak with you if you will come, both of you. Your mother, Vespertine. Marigold read it twice. The second time her hand was not steady. Oberon. I do not know what she means, Miss Quinnell. I swear it to you on the only thing I have left to swear on. I do not know. But my mother is not a woman who writes idly, and she is not a woman who summons easily. And the fact that she is summoning you means that something in the shape of this story is older than either of us understood when we walked into Lady Crestwind's antechamber last night. Marigold looked up. The candlelight made his face strange, younger in some places, older in others, the man and the boy at the same time. Did you know that you were a Quinnell? Yes, from the moment you said the name. And you did not tell me. I did not know what there was to tell. I still do not. She folded the letter. Her hands were cold. My mother has been ill for 2 years, she said quietly. Some seasons, she cannot rise from her bed. My father sold the last of her jewelry in March to pay for the doctor from London. She has never spoken to me of any Ashenwild, not once. Not even to remark upon the great houses of the north when we passed North Witten on the road to my aunt's last summer. Then we shall ask her, Oberon said, when this season is done. Or before. For a moment they stood together in the gallery, 2 strangers who had become, over the course of one absurd evening and one very long morning, something rather harder to name. The deerhound from the entrance hall had padded silently after them, and lay now in the doorway, watching with patient yellow eyes. Miss Quinnell. Marigold. If I am to call you Oberon. Marigold. He said it carefully, the way a man tries on a coat he is not yet sure will fit. I owe you an apology. I have not spoken to anyone in this house at this length on any subject in 4 years. I am out of practice. If I am cold to you tomorrow or the day after, I would ask you to forgive it before it occurs, because I don't always notice when I am doing it. That is the strangest apology I have ever been offered. It is the most honest one I am capable of. She laughed, softly, surprised, and the laugh caught him off guard. And for one full, unguarded instant, the Duke of Ashenwild smiled. Properly. With his whole mouth, with a small crease at the corner of his eye that Marigold suspected had not appeared in some considerable time. It was gone almost at once, but she had seen it, and she would remember it. Oberon, she said, I have something I should tell you. She drew the folded note from her reticule, the unsigned warning from the writing desk in the south rooms, and placed it in his hand. He read it. The smile, what was left of it, vanished. This was in your room, on the writing desk, when I arrived this afternoon. In whose hand? I do not know. He turned the paper toward the candle. He examined the fold, the paper itself, the small blot of ink at the lower edge. His face was very still. I do, he said at last. "I know this hand." "Whose?" "Vespertine's." A pause. "My mother's." Marigold's breath caught. "But she is at North Whitton." "She was, 3 days ago." He folded the note slowly. "Marigold, my mother has not been in this house in 3 years. If this was on your desk this afternoon, she has either come south without writing to me, or someone in this house has been in correspondence with her and has placed it there on her behalf." The deerhound rose from the doorway. Down the gallery, far away, a clock struck the half-hour. Somewhere below them, the dinner gong was sounding. Once, twice, 3 times, the long bronze note rolling up the stairwell. "There is a third possibility, Oberon." "Yes, that she is in this house now." He did not answer. He folded the note. He placed it in the inner pocket of his coat with the letter from North Whitton, and he offered her his arm with the same careful formality he had offered it the night before in the Raven's Hollow ballroom. And only Marigold, who was beginning, against every reasonable instinct, to learn him, could have noticed that the hand he offered was not entirely steady. "Dinner," he said quietly, "is being served." They walked back along the gallery together. The deerhound followed. At the head of the stairs, Oberon paused, only for a heartbeat, only long enough for her to notice, and looked back over his shoulder, down the long shadowed gallery, as though he expected to see someone standing at the other end. There was no one there. But the candle beneath his grandfather's portrait, which had been steady the whole time they spoke, had, at some moment Marigold had not seen, gone out. 3 days had passed since the candle in the gallery had gone out, and in that time Marigold had learned 3 things about Ashenwold House. The first was that there were rooms in it that no one entered. The 3rd floor of the east wing remained shut. Mrs. Inchwood walked past those doors without looking at them, and Phoebe, when Marigold had asked, had said only, "Those were her ladyship's rooms, miss, the dowager, before she went north." The second was that Oberon worked. He worked with the grim, unbroken concentration of a man who had taught his hands to keep moving so that his mind could not stop. He was at his desk by 6, in the saddle by 10, returned by 1 for a cold luncheon eaten standing, and back at the desk until dinner. He spoke to her at meals, briefly, courteously, without warmth and without coldness, the careful neutrality of a man who had decided, for reasons of his own, to ration his presence. The third was that the unsigned note had not been the last. A second note had appeared on her writing desk on the second morning. "Do not go to North Whitton yet. Wait for me. A friend." A third, on the morning of the Lissingham Assembly. "Tonight she will be there. The woman in the rose silk. Mind her gloves." A friend. Marigold had told Oberon about each one. He had read each one. He had said very little. But on the morning of the assembly, as the carriage was being brought round, and Phoebe was settling the long folds of the silver-blue silk gown about Marigold's slippers, the Duke had come to the door of the south rooms and said, without preamble, "My grandaunt has agreed to attend tonight. She has not been to a public ball in 7 years. If she has agreed to come, it is because she expects something to happen, and she wishes to be there when it does. I want you to stay close to her. Do you understand me, Marigold?" "Yes, Oberon." "Closer than you stay to me." "Yes." He had nodded once, sharply, and gone. The Lissingham Assembly Rooms had been built in the last reign, and they retained, in their long, pale blue ballroom and their many-mirrored galleries, the cold elegance of a building designed by men who valued symmetry above warmth. The candles tonight numbered, by Marigold's count, just over 400. The orchestra was twice the size of Ravenshollow's. Half of London was in the room before 9, and the other half arrived between 9 and 10, with the deliberate lateness of people who wished to be observed entering. Marigold walked into the ballroom on the Duke of Ashenvild's arm, and for the second time in 8 days, she heard a hush move through a crowd at the sight of them. "Steady," Oberon murmured, low against her ear. "They have been waiting. For what? To see whether the rumor is true, whether I will dance again, or whether last week was a single madness, now safely past." She lifted her chin a fraction. "And which is it, Your Grace?" "That, Miss Quinnell, is rather the question of the evening." Lady Honoria swept in behind them, on the arm of a bored-looking elderly cousin from her Sarnsfield connection, and the second hush that moved through the room was, if anything, more reverent than the first. The Dowager Countess of Sarnsfield had not been seen in society since the death of her husband, and she had chosen tonight, of all nights, to reappear in pale violet silk and a circlet of diamonds that no one in the room could quite stop looking at. She caught Marigold's eye across the floor. She did not smile. She inclined her head a fraction of an inch, and that was all the instruction Marigold required. "I am to attend her ladyship," Marigold murmured. "Go. I will find you for the supper dance." She crossed the room to where Lady Honoria had taken up a position near the long western wall, beneath a portrait of some forgotten Lissingham Viscount, and the Dowager Countess accepted her arrival without comment, as though Marigold were a fan she had set down a moment earlier and now picked up again. "The woman in rose silk," Lady Honoria said quietly, without turning her head, "is not Lady Persimmon Crestwind. No, my lady. Look toward the third pillar on the east side, beside the Bramshaw girl." Marigold looked, standing in conversation with a tall, fair-haired young woman she had seen at Raven's Hollow. The same young woman, in fact, whose smile had not moved when Marigold had walked toward the alcove, was a slighter, darker figure in pale rose silk, gloved to the elbow, a closed white fan held very still in her left hand. She was perhaps 30. Her face was striking rather than pretty, high-boned, intelligent, and watchful. "Who is she, my lady?" "Her name is Cordelia Winter Marchbanks. She is the widow of a younger son of the Marchbanks line, and she was, before her marriage and her widowing, a very great friend of my niece by marriage Vespertine." "His Grace's mother?" "Yes." The crowd shifted. Mrs. Marchbanks turned her head slowly, and her dark eyes found Marigold across the ballroom with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been waiting for her to look up. She did not smile. She did not nod. She lifted her closed fan very slightly and tilted it once toward her own left shoulder. "My lady," Marigold whispered, "what does that gesture mean?" "It means, child, that she wishes to speak with you, in private, and before the evening is much older." "Is she dangerous?" Lady Honoria considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "She is complicated, which in this room is generally worse." The first 3 dances passed without incident. Oberon took Marigold for the second, a careful country dance, in which his hand and hers met only in glancing patterns down the line, and she felt the eyes of the room follow them with the steady attention of an audience watching a wire act over a long drop. Lady Persimmon Crestwind was present. Marigold had seen her early, holding court near the orchestra, surrounded by the same fair-haired young woman in pale rose and 3 other matrons, whose names Marigold did not yet know. Lady Crestwind had not approached. Lady Crestwind had not, in fact, looked at her once, which Lady Honoria had murmured dryly was a worse sign than open hostility. Between the third and fourth dances, Marigold excused herself to the retiring rooms. She did not reach them. Halfway down the long mirrored corridor between the ballroom and the supper rooms, a hand touched her elbow. Light, gloved, deliberate. "Miss Quinnell." A word. Cordelia Marchbanks. Closer, her face was sharper than it had seemed from across the ballroom, the cheekbones more pronounced, the eyes nearly black in the candlelight. She did not release Marigold's elbow. "Mrs. Marchbanks," I am the friend who wrote to you. I am the friend who left the notes." Marigold's breath stopped. "How did you— Not here! Through this door! 2 minutes. Less if you are quick." She pulled Marigold into a small, unlit anteroom, a cloakroom by the look of it, a bench against one wall, and a great gilt mirror on the other, and shut the door and turned the key. "Listen to me," Cordelia Marchbanks said, low and fast. "I am going to tell you 3 things, and I am going to tell them quickly, because you have perhaps 4 minutes before you will be missed. First, your mother and Vespertine Ashenwilde were closer than sisters once. They were schoolfellows at Mrs. Halverstone's establishment in Bath. They took a vow there, at 16, that has bound both their families ever since, and your mother has never told you of it, because she made a second vow afterward, to her husband, that she would not." "What vow? Second?" Cordelia's grip tightened. "There is a man in London tonight who has been searching for the daughter of Sophronia Quesnel for some years. He is a careful man. He is a patient man. He learned 8 days ago at Raven's Hollow what your face looks like, and he has been waiting since to confirm it. He is in the ballroom now." "Who?" "Third. The man in the ballroom is the brother of the man your mother was supposed to marry. The man whose letters Lady Crestwind would have read aloud last week. The man who did not die of fever in the Indies, Miss Quesnel. He came home 20 years ago. He has been in England the whole time." The room tilted. Marigold reached behind her to steady herself against the bench. "That cannot be." "It is. Your mother does not know. Your father does not know. Vespertine Ashenwilde knows, and I know, and now you know, and there is a reason I am telling you tonight rather than tomorrow." "Why?" "Because tomorrow you will be at Northwitten, and once you are there, you will not be allowed to leave until certain things have been said to you. And one of those things, Miss Quesnel, is going to ask you to make a choice between your mother's truth and your own. I would rather you made it knowing what the choice is." A footstep in the corridor outside. Cordelia released her arm. "Find me before midnight. I will be in the supper room by the 3rd window. I will leave a single white camellia on the sill. Come to me there." Her dark eyes searched Marigold's face. "And Miss Quesnel, say nothing of this to the Duke. Yet." "Why?" "Because he does not know, either." She turned the key. "And he is the one of us who can least afford to learn it tonight." She was gone before Marigold could answer. Marigold stood for one long moment in the unlit cloakroom, her hand pressed to the bench, her heart making a small, mad sound against her ribs. Then she straightened her gloves. Then she opened the door. The corridor was empty. She walked back along the long, mirrored hall, past her own pale reflection in 8 successive glasses, and reached the threshold of the ballroom just as the orchestra struck up the supper waltz. Oberon was already crossing the floor toward her. He had seen her face from 20 paces away. She watched him register it, the set of her shoulders, the pallor under her rouge, and she watched the practiced courtly mask of the Duke of Ashenwilde slip a 1/4 inch sideways before he caught it. "Marigold. Dance with me, Oberon. Are you? Dance with me." He took her into his arms without another word. The waltz began. Halfway across the floor, as he turned her past the orchestra, Marigold lifted her eyes to the gallery and saw, leaning against the rail above them, a man she had never seen before in her life. He was perhaps 50. Lean, weather-burnt, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a face she would have called unremarkable, except that he was watching her. Only her, with the perfect, undivided attention of a man who had been waiting 20 years to do so. Their eyes met. He inclined his head, and Marigold, with the music rising around her and the Duke of Ashenwilde's hand steady at her back, understood for the first time in her life that she had not been brought to London this season for a marriage at all. She had been brought to London to be found. She did not faint. She did not falter. She finished the waltz on Oberon's arm, smiled at the appropriate moments, curtsied at the appropriate moment, and allowed him to lead her from the floor with the composure of a woman to whom nothing whatsoever had happened. He saw through it at once. "The library," he said, low against her ear, as they passed the supper-room door. "The small one on the gallery floor. Now, Lady Honoria, my grandaunt knows. She has already gone home. Phoebe is waiting with your cloak. Now, Marigold." He took her up the back stair, the servants' stair, narrow and dark, and lit only at intervals by single tallow candles in iron sconces. The Lissingham Library was on the first gallery, a small paneled room with one oil lamp burning low on the writing table, and a fire someone had banked an hour ago and forgotten. He shut the door. He turned the key. "Tell me, Oberon, tell me what you saw. Tell me what was said to you in that corridor. Tell me everything, Marigold, and tell me now." She told him. She told him about Cordelia Marchbanks, the locked anteroom, the three things, and the white camellia. She told him about her mother and Vespertine at 16, about the vow at Mrs. Halverstone's, about the man in the gallery whose eyes had not left her face. She told him because there was no one else in the world to tell, and because the Duke of Ashenveld was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not shuddered, not careful, but open, fully and unguardedly open, the way a door is open when a man has decided not to bother closing it again. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The man in the gallery," he said. "Describe him again. Tall, lean, 50 perhaps, hair gone gray at the temples, a face that has been long in the sun. He wore evening dress, but it sat on him like borrowed clothes. He had a small scar at the left side of his jaw." Oberon closed his eyes. "Oberon, who is he?" "His name is Captain Roland Theobald Verity." She felt the room move beneath her. "Verity? Yes. That is my middle name, Marigold Verity Quinnell. Yes. My mother gave me that name. Yes, Marigold." She sat down. There was a chair behind her, which was fortunate, because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her weight. "He is the man she was to marry. He is the man she was to marry. He is alive. He is alive. He has been in England these 20 years. He served in the Peninsula after the Indies, and came home wounded, soon after your mother's marriage. He was told by Lady Crestwyn's faction, by the woman herself, I am all but certain, that your mother had refused to wait, had married another, and had asked never to be sought. He believed it. He retired to a small property in Northumberland. He has lived there quietly ever since. How do you know this?" Oberon drew a long breath. "Because Captain Verity is my mother's first cousin, Marigold, and because 3 weeks ago, at Northwitten, my mother, who does not write to me, who has not spoken willingly to me in 3 years, sent word that he had at last learned the truth, and that he had asked her one question. Where is the child?" The fire shifted. A coal fell inward. The small, bright sound seemed, in the silence of the library, very loud. "The child," Marigold whispered. "The child. He thinks I am. He thinks I might be. He does not yet know what to think. Neither do I. Neither, I suspect, does your mother. But he has asked the question, and once the question is asked, Marigold, it cannot be unasked." She could not at first speak. She had, at 16, asked her mother once why she had been given a name like Verity. "Because, my darling," her mother had said, very softly, smoothing Marigold's hair, "I wished you to be known by the truth, even if the world should one day be unkind to it." Marigold had thought it a pretty answer. She had thought nothing of it since. "Oberon." "Yes. Is my father, is the man I have called my father all my life. I do not know, Marigold. I do not know, and I will not pretend to know, and I will not let you go to Northwitten tomorrow without knowing. You will be told the truth there, by my mother, in her own words. And whatever the truth is, you will not face it alone." He had been standing the whole time. Now he came across the small library to where she sat, and he knelt, slowly, carefully, the way a man kneels who has not done so in a long time. And he took both her cold hands in his. "Marigold, Oberon. I don't know what is true. I know that 8 days ago I had not danced in 4 years, and that my brother was dead, and that I had agreed with myself that I would live what remained of my life with my hands folded. I know that on the night of the Raven's Hollow ball, you walked across a room toward me, and you asked me a question I could not refuse, and that since that night I have been awake, Marigold. Awake, in a way that I had decided, 4 years ago, was no longer permitted to me." His hands were warm. Hers were not. "I made a bargain with you," he went on, very quietly. "I made it because I needed it. I want tonight to release you from one half of it. Oberon, you may leave, at any time after tonight. The bargain is dissolved. If at Northwitten tomorrow, my mother tells you a thing that means you must go home to your own family, to your true family, whatever shape that turns out to be, you may go, and there will be no claim of mine upon you. None. I will not hold you to a single ball more." She closed her eyes. "And the other half of the bargain, Oberon, what of that?" "The other half," he said, "I will hold to until the day I die, if you will let me." She opened her eyes. He was very close. The small lamp on the writing table caught the silver at his temples and the line of his jaw, and the look on his face was the look she had glimpsed for one unguarded instant in the long gallery at Ashenwild House. The man beneath the Duke, the boy beneath the man. "What are the words, Oberon?" "I am here, Marigold." It was not what she had expected. She had expected, perhaps, "I love you," the phrase the world had long ago worn thin. "I am here" was not the same. "I am here" was, for a man who had not been here for 4 years, an oath of staggering weight. She understood it. "Oberon. Yes, stand up." He stood. She stood with him. And she lifted her face, and he bent his. And the kiss, when it came, was not the kiss she had imagined a duke might give a young woman in a borrowed library at midnight. It was slower. It was steadier. It was the kiss of a man who had rehearsed nothing, because 4 years ago he had set down all such rehearsals and forgotten the shape of them. When at last he drew back, he did not let go of her hands. "Whatever Northwitten tells us tomorrow," he said very quietly. "Whatever the answer." "Whatever the answer," she echoed. There was a sound, then, in the corridor outside the library. A footstep, then a second, then the soft, unmistakable creak of a person leaning against the panel of the door, very near to the keyhole, listening. Oberon's head came up. His hand tightened on hers. He crossed the library in 3 silent strides and turned the key. The door swung open onto the empty corridor, but on the floor at the threshold, placed with the delicate precision of a calling card laid on a hall salver, lay a single white camellia. And beneath the camellia, folded once, was a small square of paper. Oberon picked it up. He read it. His face changed. He held it out to her without speaking. The handwriting was Cordelia Marchbanks's. The ink was still wet. "He is gone. He will not approach you tonight. But he asks you, through me, to come to him at Northwitten, and to come alone." A friend. They did not go to Northwitten the next morning. They were prevented from going by the woman who arrived at Ashenwill House at 7 o'clock, in a hired carriage with the blinds drawn, and who refused to give her name to Mrs. Inchwood at the door. "I am here," she said, "for the Duke, and for Miss Quinnell. Tell them it is Vespertine." She had not seen her son in 3 years. She did not embrace him when he came down the great staircase. She allowed him to take her hand and lift it briefly to his lips, and she said only, in a voice that had once been beautiful and was now quiet and very tired, "Oberon, I am sorry to have come without writing." "Mother, where is the girl?" Marigold was already on the stair behind him. She came down slowly in the morning gown Phoebe had laced her into less than an hour before, with the curls of last night still pinned and now falling loose at her temple. She had not slept. She had read Cordelia's note 7 times. She had read Oberon's silence when he sat across from her at the breakfast table and did not eat, more times than she could count. Vespertine Aschenwalde was perhaps 55. She was thinner than the small portrait in the gallery had suggested, much thinner, and her hair was the color of birch bark, and her eyes were Oberon's eyes, only softer, only sadder. She looked at Marigold for a long, long moment. "You have her mouth," she said at last. "My mother's, my lady?" "Yes, Sophronia's. I see her in you. I had wondered if I would." The drawing room, the deerhound at the hearth, the fire newly lit and not yet warm. Vespertine sat. She accepted no tea. She set her gloves in her lap very neatly and folded her hands above them. "I have come south, Oberon, because last night a man called at my door at Northwitten an hour before midnight. He had ridden from London. He was a man I have not seen in 20 years and had not expected to see again. And he asked me a question that I had, until last night, believed I would never have to answer. Captain Verity. Yes. Mother. Is she his?" Vespertine closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a long moment. "I do not know, Oberon." "Mother. I do not know. Sophronia herself does not know. There were 2 months, Oberon. 2 months between the ship that was reported lost and her marriage to Quenelle that have never been spoken of in 22 years by anyone who knew of them. I know what was asked of me at the time. I know what I helped to arrange. I know what vow your father's sister and I made together the night after Sophronia's wedding to keep a child safe whose paternity might, only might, come one day to be questioned." She opened her eyes. "I don't know, child. I am sorry. Truly, I am sorry. The only person on this earth who can answer the question with certainty is Sophronia herself. And Sophronia, 22 years ago, asked me on her wedding eve never to ask her." Marigold felt very far away from her own body. "Then there is no answer. There is one answer that may be obtained. How? By going to her, today, together. You and Oberon and I, in his carriage, to Wrenfold Cottage, and asking her, gently, with all of us in the room, the question we have all of us avoided for 22 years. A silence. "My lady," Marigold began. "Vespertine, if we are going to do this, child, do not call me my lady." "Vespertine. Yes, my mother is ill, truly ill. I am not certain she is strong enough for this. I know. Then, and I know also, child, that Captain Verity is at this moment riding for Wrenfold himself, and that if we do not reach her before he does, the question will be asked of her with no one in the room who loves her. He has been wronged. He's not a cruel man, but he has been wronged, and 20 years of silence have made him afraid that another silence will swallow what is left." She rose. "My carriage is in your courtyard, Oberon. I have not unpacked. We may leave within the hour." Oberon was already standing. "We leave at once." He turned to Marigold. "Marigold. Yes, you are not bound to come. I am bound by something older than any bargain you and I made, Oberon. Of course I am coming." She crossed the drawing room. She did not look at the deerhound, or the fire, or the small writing desk, where, 3 days ago, a strange note had appeared in a hand she now knew to be Vespertine's. She did not look back at the great staircase, or the south rooms, or the long gallery, where, on the night of her arrival, a candle had gone out. She walked into the courtyard, and into the carriage, and into the road that ran north out of London, toward Renfold and her mother, and toward the truth that had been waiting, with the unhurried patience of all old truths, 22 years to be asked. Renfold lay 70 miles north of London, in a wooded fold of country where the road climbed slowly along the line of a chalk stream, past hedgerows white with hawthorn and small gray villages where dogs barked at the carriage and children ran out to watch it pass. They reached the cottage at 4:30 in the afternoon. Captain Verity's bay mare was tied at the gate. Oberon saw her first. He laid his hand briefly over Marigold's and said, very quietly, "He is here. We are not too late, but he is here. Marigold, let me speak to him first." "No, Oberon." "Marigold, he has been waiting 20 years. He will not wait another half hour. I will go in. With Vespertine. You will follow when I send for you. That is how this must be done." He looked at her, and she watched him gather, with a visible effort, every protective instinct of the man he had become in the last 8 days, and set them down. "As you wish," he said. The cottage at Renfold was small. 4 rooms downstairs, 3 above, a kitchen garden gone slightly to seed, a parlor with a low ceiling, and a window looking out upon the lane. Marigold had been born in the room above this parlor. Her brother had died in it. She knew every floorboard, every smell, boiled linen and lavender water, and the faint mineral coolness of the well at the back door. And she knew, the moment she stepped over the threshold, that her mother was not in her bed. Her mother was in the parlor. She was sitting in the high-backed chair by the window, in a shawl Marigold had not seen for 2 years, with her thin hands folded in her lap, and across from her, in the carved oak chair that had belonged to Marigold's grandfather, sat Captain Roland Theobald Verity, his hat upon his knee, his hands very still. They were not speaking. They had been speaking. Marigold could see it in the angle of her mother's head, in the dampness at the corner of her eye, in the way Captain Verity's mouth was set. But when the parlor door opened, and Marigold stepped inside, with Vespertine Ashenwilde behind her, in a traveling cloak still dusted from the road, both of them turned, and both of them stopped. Sophronia Quinnell looked at her daughter. "Marigold." "Mama." "Oh, my child, my child." Marigold crossed the parlor and knelt at her mother's chair. Her mother's hands closed over hers, thin, dry, cool, more bone than flesh now. And Marigold pressed her face into her mother's lap and did not weep, because some grief is too large for weeping, and asks instead only to be held still inside. "Mama, they have told me. Some of it. I have come to ask you the rest." "Yes." "Mama, do you know?" A silence. Then her mother's hand, very gently, lifted her daughter's chin. "I know, my darling. I have known for 21 years. I have not had the courage until now to say so." Marigold's breath stopped. "Whose?" "Your father's. The man you have called your father all your life. Edmund Quinnell. There is no question of it, Marigold. There has never, in my own heart, been any question of it." But her eyes moved, then to the man in the oak chair, and Marigold saw the cost of what was being said written in every line of her mother's face. There was a question of it in Roland's heart when he came home, because I had not waited the full year, and I could not, my darling. I could not bear to make him face that question without an answer. Her hand tightened on Marigold's. I let him believe 20 years ago that I had refused to wait because I had ceased to love him. It was not true, but it was the kinder lie, and I have lived with it, my darling, every day since. Captain Verity did not move. He had heard, Marigold realized, the answer he had ridden 70 miles to hear, and the answer was no, and he was, for the second time in 20 years, being given the truth of his own loss. "Sophronia," he said very quietly. "Roland. I would have come back for you, whatever the answer had been. I would have come back for you. I know. Why did you not write to me? Because I had married a kind man, Roland. Because that kind man had given me a daughter, and a home, and a life. Because to write to you would have been to ask you to wait again, and I had asked you to wait once, and I had not the right to ask it twice." He closed his eyes. For a long moment the room held only the sound of the wind moving in the apple tree at the back of the cottage and the small ticking of the long case clock in the hall. When he opened his eyes again, they were not on Sophronia. They were on Marigold, Miss Quinnell. "Captain Verity, you are not my daughter." "No, sir." "I am, if you will allow me, your mother's old and dear friend. I would like, with your permission, to be that. Nothing more. I will not press, and I will not intrude, and I will not ever again come to this house unannounced. But I have no people of my own, child, and your mother and I have lost 20 years that perhaps need not have been lost, and I would be glad of it. Glad." Marigold rose. She crossed the parlor to the carved oak chair, and she stood before Captain Verity, with her hands folded neatly at her waist, the way her mother had once taught her to stand before guests, and she said, with the small, absolute steadiness of a woman who has at last understood what she was brought to London for, "You are welcome at this house, Captain Verity, as my mother's friend. For as long as you both shall live." He bowed his head. He did not weep. She suspected he had stopped knowing how, 20 years ago, in a regiment in the Indies. But he bent his head and pressed his hand briefly to his mouth, and when he straightened, he was an older man than he had been a moment before, and a calmer one. "Thank you, child. Sir." He rose. He took up his hat. He bowed, very correctly, to Vespertine Ashenvilt, who, Marigold realized only now, had been silent the entire time, standing at the door with one hand pressed flat against the panel as though to keep herself from falling. And he said, "Vespertine, Roland, I will not trouble you further. You are not a trouble. You have never been a trouble. You have been a wound, Roland, in this family and in mine, and the wound is not healed today, but it is spoken today, and speaking is the first medicine." He bowed again and went out into the lane, and Marigold heard the small, quiet creak of the gate, and the soft thud of his boot in the stirrup, and the slow walk of the bay mare down the lane toward the village. She did not go to the window. She did not need to. She turned back to her mother. "Mama, my darling, tell me then the rest." Her mother told her. She told her of Mrs. Halverstone's school in Bath, of the friendship between two motherless girls, of the vow they had made together at 16, that whichever of us first marries, the other will stand witness, and whichever of us first bears a daughter, the other will be that daughter's second mother, and we will not be parted by any death or any silence. She told her of Roland's ship reported lost in the autumn of 2 and 3, of the long winter without word, of Edmund Quinnell's quiet, patient, undemanding courtship through that winter, of the spring in which she had at last said yes, and of the letter that had reached her 3 weeks after her wedding, saying that the ship had been found, that the report had been wrong, that Captain Verity was alive in a hospital in Madeira, and would be home before midsummer. "I went to Vespertine," her mother said. "I didn't know what to do. She didn't know either. We agreed only that, if I was already with child by Edmund, the question that Roland would inevitably ask must have an answer that was clear, and clean, and true. We agreed that we would tell him the truth, and we agreed also that we would not tell him until we knew. And by the time we knew, Marigold, by the time you were born, and we knew, Roland had been told the lie. By Lady Crestwind, who hated me, Marigold, who has hated me for 22 years for marrying the man she had wished, and for being loved by the man she had loved, and who said the lie to Roland, not to spare him, but to break him. Marigold sat upon the floor at her mother's feet. She did not feel young. She did not feel old. She felt, for the first time perhaps in her life, known. Mama, the letters Lady Crestwind had, the ones she would have read at Ravenshollow. They were never the danger, my darling. The danger was always that Roland would find me. Lady Crestwind kept the letters because she believed, in her cruelty, that if Roland was ever told the truth, the letters would still be enough to ruin our family, to ensure that whatever I had built without her, she could yet take from me. And tonight, he knows the truth. And tonight he knows the truth. Then the letters are nothing. Then the letters are nothing. Marigold pressed her cheek against her mother's knee. In the doorway of the parlor, Vespertine Aschenwilde turned away, and stepped into the small front hall, and stood for a long moment at the threshold of the cottage, and looked down the lane after the small dust the bay mare had raised. And then, quietly, she opened the front door of the cottage and beckoned, and the Duke of Aschenwilde, who had been standing at the gate of his mother's old friend's house for 40 minutes, without sitting, without speaking, without doing anything but waiting, came in. He came into the parlor. He went down on one knee beside Marigold, on the worn rug she had played on as a child, and he took her hand. Marigold. Oberon. You are not bound to me. No, Oberon. Then I am asking you, freely, the question I have not yet asked. Will you stay? Yes. In every sense of the word. In every sense of the word, Oberon. Sophronia Quinnell, in the high-backed chair by the window of the cottage in which she had been ill for 2 years, let her thin hand rest very lightly upon her daughter's hair, and Vespertine Aschenwilde, in the doorway, closed her eyes. The last ball of the season was held at Cantermere House on the 2nd of June, and all of London came, partly because Cantermere House had not been open for entertainments in 11 years, and partly because everyone in the room had heard the rumor and wished to see whether it was true. The rumor was that the Duke of Aschenwilde, who had not danced in 4 years, and had then danced once with a young woman no one had heard of, had since that night been seen in her company at every public event of the season. That she had vanished from London for 17 days in April. That she had returned in May upon his arm with the Dowager Countess of Sarnsfield walking at her other side, and that the Dowager Countess of Sarnsfield, who had not been heard to publicly approve of any young woman in 40 years, had at the Marchwarden Assembly on the 23rd of May been observed to pat Miss Quinnell's hand. Lady Persimmon Crestwind was not at Cantermere that night. She had withdrawn from the season 3 weeks earlier, after a private interview with Lady Honoria Magdalena Aschenwilde, from which she had emerged, white-faced and silent, and which neither woman had ever afterward described. Marigold descended the great staircase of Cantermere House in a gown of pale gold tissue, with seed pearls at the hem and her grandmother's small garnet cross at her throat, and on her arm walked Oberon Lysander Aschenwilde, and 3 steps behind them, in lavender silk and the same circlet of diamonds she had worn at Lissingham, walked Lady Honoria. The orchestra had been instructed to wait. At the foot of the stair, Oberon turned to Marigold. He did not lower his voice. The hall was full. The ballroom was fuller. Every pair of eyes in Cantermere House was upon them. Miss Quinnell, Your Grace, I am told that at every great ball one must, by the courtesy of the room, wait for one's hostess to call the first set, and one mustn't before then ask any question of any kind. So I am told, Your Grace. I find tonight that I am unwilling to wait. He took her hand. Marigold Verity Quinnell, will you do me the honor, before the orchestra plays a single note, and before this room is permitted to begin the season's last evening, of dancing the first set with me, and every set after this one until the day I die? The hall did not gasp. It had run by now, out of capacity for gasping at the Duke of Ashenwild. It only stilled, the long, pleased stillness of a room that has been rooting, secretly, for a particular ending. Marigold curtsied. Properly, the way her mother had taught her at Renfold Cottage, in the small parlor with the low ceiling, 8 years before, and the way she had practiced again, 3 weeks ago, in that same parlor, while her mother watched from the window chair, with her eyes bright. Your Grace. Yes, it would be my very great honor. The orchestra struck up. They danced. 11 months later. The library at Ashenwild House had a new occupant. She slept at present in a low cradle of carved beechwood beside the hearth, and her name was Sophronia Vespertine Honoria Ashenwild, which everyone agreed was a great deal of name for a person who weighed 8 pounds and had been alive for 9 days. The deerhound lay at the foot of the cradle. The deerhound had not, since the child's arrival, allowed himself to be coaxed more than 3 feet from her. Marigold was at the writing desk by the window, the same walnut writing desk, brought down from the south rooms when she found the letter. It had been folded into the back of the small leather book of household accounts that Mrs. Inchwood had given her on her arrival the previous summer, and which Marigold had not, until that morning, opened to its final pages. The handwriting was Cassian Ashenwild's. He had been 17 when he had written it. The date upon it was the eve of the fire at Belmerek. A. I am writing this in case the worst should happen, because we have promised each other, you and I, that we should never leave anything unsaid. If you are reading this, brother, then I have gone first, and I am sorry for that, because you will take it very hard, and you will take it harder than is fair. Listen to me now, eh? You are not to set yourself down for it. Whatever the shape of it, whatever you remember, and whatever you do not. You are not to take the rest of your life and use it to pay a debt that is not owed. Find someone, Oberon. Find someone who will make you laugh again. Mother used to say that grief is a country one can visit, but no one is meant to settle there. Do not settle there for me. Promise. Your loving brother, Cassian. Marigold read it twice. She rose. She crossed the library. She knelt beside the chair where Oberon was reading, and she pressed the letter into his hand without speaking, because some things must be given, in this life, without explanation. He read it. He read it again. He did not speak. He pressed the back of one hand against his mouth, and Marigold reached up and brushed her fingers very gently across his temple, and they sat together that way for a long time, while the deerhound watched the cradle, and the cradle held the daughter, and the fire moved very quietly in the hearth. When at last he could speak, he said, "He always was the better of us. He always was. Marigold, Oberon, I am here, and I." The infant in the cradle stirred. The deerhound lifted his great gray head, and outside the long windows of the library at Ashenwild House, the late spring light slanted gold across the gardens, and somewhere in the square, a child was laughing, and the world went on. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. Stories like this one exist because of you. Because you believe that grief is a country we are meant to visit, but never to settle in. Because you believe that bold women may walk across ballrooms toward the men no one else will approach, and that quiet men may be brought back to themselves by being asked, simply, for a single dance. Because you believe that the truth, however long delayed, is always worth the journey to find it. If a particular line, or a particular scene, stayed with you tonight, I would love to know which. Your comments are how I learn what your hearts respond to and what stories to bring you next. And if you would like more stories like this one, stories with quiet men and brave women, with old griefs and earned joys, with endings that ask you to feel rather than merely to watch, please do consider subscribing. There is a new story waiting for you, just one click away. Until next time.